if sea level rises, millions, tens of millions of people will be displaced around the world. Some nations will be underwater. And so whether large nations like it or not, the consequence of sea level rise is a planetary scale perspective. And to answer your question briefly, this is the challenge. How do we operate as a globally interconnected civilization, recognizing that the solutions that are on the table require us all to pull our oars in the same direction?
Remember when Donald Trump was trying to buy Greenland from Denmark? Of course, that never happened, but that wild idea did suggest a shift within the US government about engagement with the Arctic region. Because of climate change, large sheets of Arctic ice are melting, exposing vast stores of natural gas and oil. With Russia and China already miles ahead with their Arctic strategies, can the US catch up, and how? These are some of the questions we'll address in tonight's Great Decisions program, Struggles Over the Melting Arctic. I'm Mary Eintema, President and CEO of World Boston. As you may know, World Boston's mission is to foster engagement in international affairs and global cooperation. In these times, international engagement is more important than ever, even if most of us are still stuck in one place. So thank you very much for joining tonight and in this mission. And now, at long last, I am pleased to introduce this evening's speaker. You can read his full bio at worldboston.org. Dr. Paul Arthur Berkman is a renowned science diplomat. In 2010, he co-directed the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia on environmental security in the Arctic Ocean. Dr. Berkman, Professor Berkman, also founded the first Science Diplomacy Center in an academic institution at the Fletcher School, directed through EvREsearch Limited, where he is the CEO.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's a pleasure and an honor. I will do my best to share screens efficiently. So let's see here. Excellent. Hello, audience. Please do consider questions, and I will do my very best to address them. The topic tonight is struggles over the melting Arctic, and Mary introduced the comments, the amusing comments by our last president regarding purchase of Greenland. I'm pleased to say that the Greenland Prime Minister responded by saying that Greenland is not for sale, but we are open for business. Fortunately, we are on a new direction with the Arctic, and one of more cooperation and spirit of unity. But the issue today regards the struggles over the melting Arctic, and the Arctic is indeed melting. The picture that you have on your screen in front of you, that yellow line, is the average sea ice minimum, the minimum amount of sea ice between 1979, when satellites began to take pictures of the Arctic throughout the year, and 2010. And what you see in the middle of that is that white area in the ocean. That was the sea ice extent in September of 2012, which is the lowest amount of sea ice that has been observed by satellite since 1979. And what we have today is an Arctic Ocean that is mostly open water during the summer. And as you can see from this picture, the yellow arrow there is through the Bering Strait. So behind that is the Pacific Island beyond the Aleutian Islands, Pacific Ocean beyond the Aleutian Islands. And on the other side, next to Greenland, is the Atlantic Ocean. And today we can have ships traveling through open water between the Atlantic and the Pacific, which didn't happen just a few decades ago. And so clearly the Arctic is melting in the ocean. And we have a similar phenomenon on land in terms of permafrost. My talk today will be primarily about the ocean, but it is important to consider that the Arctic as a whole is melting on land as well as in the sea. And in a context of a system, so what I'd like to share with you are a number of perspectives about the Arctic, perspectives of different nations, perspectives of different peoples, perspectives of different industries. And if we think about it in that sense, it's a system. And a system, like any system, has boundaries. The rooms that you're comfortably sitting in is a system. It has a floor, has a ceiling, has walls, has windows that you can see in and out of, has doors that you can walk in and out of. Very much like the Arctic Ocean, where you have inflow and outflow of the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. It's got a sea floor. It's bounded by the continents, and historically it had sea ice on the surface. If I remove the ceiling to your room, you would be exposed to the outside weather, the rain, the cold, the wind, whatever the conditions are, and the dynamics in that room would change. And they would change not because of just being exposed to different outside conditions, but you would be in a different system. And if I remove the boundary to a system, in effect, I've changed the system. So when we talk about struggles over the melting Arctic, we're talking about a new system, a new ocean that exists at the top of the Earth. And that new ocean opens up opportunities and it opens up challenges. And so those are the struggles to think about during the coming hour. To properly set the stage, it's important to understand who is involved with the Arctic. Clearly, there are nations. There are 8 Arctic nations, Arctic states, that have sovereign jurisdictions north of the Arctic Circle. They're represented on this map with Greenland and Denmark, Canada, the United States, Russia, and Norway and Iceland, as well as Finland and Sweden. In addition, we have the residents of the Arctic, and importantly, those residents include indigenous peoples who have lived in the Arctic for thousands of years. And so one of the important considerations from the Arctic, like other places in the Earth where we have indigenous peoples, is what we can learn from them, particularly during a period of climate change, because these peoples have been resilient not only today, but in the face of previous periods of warming. So the context of operating in a climate-warmed world, in a sense, there are lessons that we can learn from the indigenous peoples. And so I wanted to highlight at the beginning that the Arctic is a complex of different perspectives, different histories, different rights holders, different stakeholders, different interests. And so in this picture, you have international dimensions, which are the 8 Arctic states. You also have interdisciplinary dimensions. So the white area that you see there is the same as in the picture before of the melting Arctic Ocean. That's the sea ice extent. The interdisciplinary components are not just the natural system, but they also involve the socioeconomics of the Arctic as well. And that red line that you see in the center of the Arctic Ocean around the North Pole is the high seas, the Central Arctic Ocean high seas. That's a legal boundary that exists within the law of the sea. And so what I'd like to discuss with you and open for questions is the relationships of the peoples, of the nations, of the ice itself, of the socioeconomic dynamics of this region. As I mentioned, surrounding the Arctic are its residents. And certainly one of the profound changes that is happening is the absence of sea ice in the ocean. The absence of sea ice in the ocean opens the water to slam into the coastal areas and cause erosion. And this is a picture in an area in a village called Shishmaref in Alaska, which is being rapidly eroded, and people will be moving from Shishmaref to another location because their village will disappear because of the eroding terrestrial area next to the ocean. I just wanted to again emphasize that when we talk about the Arctic, it's not only the dynamics of great powers, the struggles between the United States and Russia and China, for example, but it is the peoples that live in the Arctic. And it's important to be sensitive to their interests and their future. This is a picture of the longest satellite record of ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean. The ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean is increasing, as would be expected, because the ice is disappearing. The blue area in the middle is the Central Arctic Ocean that I've been sharing with you. These other areas are the exclusive economic zones under the law of the sea of the surrounding coastal states. And so with the satellite record, we're able to look at not only the number of ships on the order of minutes throughout every day, but we're able to look at the types of ships, the nations that they come from, and so on within specific regions. And so what you see here is the trend of increasing shipping since 2009, which is when the satellite record of ship traffic began in the Arctic Ocean. This is another picture of the Arctic Ocean with ship traffic. And what you see on the left part of this is red. That is the national ships from Russia. Russia is the dominant ship presence in the Arctic Ocean. Russia, its coastline accounts for nearly half of the coastline in the Arctic Ocean. Russia has historically been an Arctic presence. One of the activities that I've been involved with is looking at Russian laws, and we have a book on baseline of Russian Arctic laws going back to the beginning of the 19th century. So Russia itself has a very long-standing presence in the Arctic. Not to forget that the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. What you see in the bottom part of the picture is the blue area and the red area, which is the boundary, the maritime boundary between the United States and Russia. The boundary there is the longest maritime boundary in the ocean anywhere in the world. And the closest point between the United States in the Bering Strait, which is in the middle of that region, is only 2 miles. So the United States and Russia, having been superpower adversaries during the Cold War, allies during World War II, are clearly longstanding neighbors. What you see other places, you see the yellow, for example, going through the Northwest Passage. You see a diversity of ship traffic in the area of the Barents Sea, which is mostly open water during the year, and different ships and fishing fleets. For example, you can see the Spanish fishing fleet in the middle of the Barents Sea region. These are all now possible to look at from satellite objectively without consideration of boundaries. In effect, we have snapshots of the entire Arctic Ocean. So in thinking about what the struggles are, we're able to ask questions and answer them with a great deal of rigor in terms of the ship traffic in the Arctic Ocean. An example is in the Central Arctic Ocean high seas. And I highlight the high seas in particular because it's a region under international law that is beyond sovereign jurisdictions, an area beyond national jurisdictions. And the importance of that as a type of area is that it is in contrast to regions that fall within sovereign jurisdictions, where nations assert their sovereignty, sovereign rights, and jurisdiction. The high seas is an area beyond sovereign jurisdictions where the world has rights, roles, and responsibilities. And so what we're looking at in this picture on the left are the different ship tracks and the different types of nations that have moved into the Central Arctic Ocean. Most of the open water in this North Polar region is on the Pacific side of the Arctic. And what we asked as a question is, where are the ships coming from that go in to the Central Arctic Ocean high seas? And what you see on the right is an analysis of where the ships come from. Most of the ships that are coming into the Central Arctic Ocean are coming through the Bering Strait. Now, this is important if you think about questions like the Belt and Road Initiative and the concept of a polar Silk Road that have been introduced by China. The idea that there'd be a trade route, for example, through the Arctic. What would that trade route look like? Well, you'd have ships moving between Asia and Europe through the Arctic. You'd have increased number of ships that would be owned perhaps by countries like China or China specifically. On the other side of the route in Europe, you'd have ports. Ports to a significant extent are being significant ownership or now in the hands of Costco, Chinese company. And so the idea of a Belt and Road Initiative, one belt, one road initiative, where there would be built infrastructure development on a planetary scale across the 21st century, global thinking, in a sense, is being implemented in the Arctic. It is being implemented in the context of a polar Silk Road. And China is actively in the process of purchasing ships associated with the Yamal Peninsula and the region where there is liquid natural gas container fleets moving from there to ports. They're actively purchasing ports in Europe. In fact, China owns a majority shareholding in the port of Piraeus in Greece, for example. And so what you see here is that the movement into the central Arctic Ocean, this region beyond sovereign jurisdictions, beyond the rights and responsibilities just of the Arctic coastal states, is predominantly coming through the Pacific. Now, how this plays out in the future, what this means in terms of the indigenous peoples, is a significant question, because the Bering Strait region, with the United States on one side and Russia on the other, is home to a high density of villages and indigenous communities that have been there for millennia. If we think about the Arctic in a practical context, how do we use the Arctic? How do we study the Arctic? What is the relevance of the research? One example is in the ability to convene dialogues among allies and adversaries alike. So just like in the Antarctic, throughout the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated continuously, in the Arctic, since 1996, the 8 Arctic states and 6 indigenous peoples organizations have cooperated continuously using science as an inclusive, as an international and interdisciplinary framework for their cooperation. The context that Mary mentioned at the beginning in terms of Donald Trump's comments about buying Greenland and Secretary of State Pompeo's comments regarding the Arctic Council were an aberration. They were a moment of chest beating that has not emerged during the last period from 1996 to the present, when the Arctic Council as a high-level forum has been in operation. And so I illustrate this picture because it was science that enabled me, along with collaborator in Russia, to convene the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic Ocean. NATO and Russia are like oil and water. They are clearly adversaries, yet starting with questions and using science as a vehicle to facilitate inclusive dialogue, we are able to bring together ministries from Russia, 17 other nations at the level of ambassadors for a dialogue. And the book that you see on the bottom, Environmental Security in the Arctic Ocean, is a consequence. Includes statements that representatives of the President of the Russian Federation, ambassadors, and so on, with nearly 70,000 downloads. And it is that context that my activities, at least, have been involved primarily in the Arctic, as well as now globally in relation to the United Nations, in thinking about how do we operate short-term to long-term, beyond just political jousting. How do we achieve progress with sustainable development? How do we balance national interests and common interests? How do we balance economic prosperity, societal well-being, and environmental protection over generations, not just today, but thinking across the 21st century and beyond, recognizing that the young adults and children that are born today, many of them will be alive in the 22nd century. What lessons can we as a generation offer future generations in terms of hope and inspiration? And so in that process, it starts with questions. And the reason I was able to convene a dialogue between NATO and Russia wasn't because I came with answers. I came in with questions, and the questions brought together these allies and adversaries alike. The questions of common concern, whatever they may be, reveal the methods to answer those questions. Those methods may be natural science methods, studying the sea ice, for example. They may be social science methods, anthropology, economics, law. They may be indigenous knowledge, cultural through generations. But whatever those methods are to answer those questions of common concern, they generate data. And the observation is that data and questions, methods, that's research. The observation is that data is transformed into evidence for decisions in the context of institutions. Those institutions can be related to governance mechanisms like foreign ministries. The evidence also is used for decisions for built infrastructure, what to build, where to build it, mobile assets, fixed assets, things that require capitalization and technology. However, evidence for decisions itself is incomplete. The question is, what are the options that are available to the decision makers to use, to consider across a continuum of urgencies from short-term to long-term, ultimately to produce informed decisions, decisions that operate short-term to long-term. These are not just good decisions or bad decisions, right decisions or wrong decisions. These are decisions that optimize the available information, recognizing that the challenges that we face, the struggles that we face today are ongoing. We're living in a world of change. How do we as a generation respond to change? How do we set in motion the processes that will operate across time? To that extent, the Arctic has been very productive. And then over the last 10 years, these are the documents, binding agreements that have emerged and are emerging in relation to the Arctic. In 2011, there was an Arctic Search and Rescue Agreement. In 2013, an Arctic Marine Pollution Preparedness and Response Agreement. In 2017, under the chairmanship of the United States for the Arctic Council, there was an Arctic Science Agreement. There was a Polar Code that came into force in 2017 for the Arctic as well as the Antarctic. And there's currently pending an agreement on the Central Arctic Ocean high seas fisheries. All of these agreements involve science. They involve evidence, they involve decision making, and they involve informed decisions, decisions that would operate short-term to long-term. And so in that sense, in terms of challenges and the struggles, and I understand, having been involved with this discussion for decades already, that the easy tendency is to look at the Arctic or other regions in terms of gloom and doom, all of the things that are going wrong, and to cast them in a very negative light, perhaps for the purposes of selling newspapers or something like that. I remember writing an article, an op-ed for the New York Times about peace in the Arctic, and never included the word war once, but to sell the article, the New York Times gave it the title, Preventing an Arctic Cold War. And so the context is important in the sense of thinking about how we can build an Arctic that is stable, resilient, and peaceful in the face of significant change. And so one perspective are nations looking inward from their national boundaries. The other perspective is the world looking outward from regions that are beyond sovereign jurisdiction in the sense of the high seas. And it is this balance of perspectives that is involved in thinking about how to balance national interests and common interests. It is a particular pleasure and an honor to speak with World Boston. The notion of world and Boston is juxtaposed in the same sense that the Arctic is world and the Arctic. At one level, we have national jurisdictions, we have an international imprint, and we have subnational. And so in a sense, the challenges that we face as a civilization, global civilization, interconnected on a planetary scale without ambiguity because of the pandemic today, or the world wars last century, we live in a globally interconnected civilization. And so it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to share the Arctic briefly with you in the context of this discussion with World Boston. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Paul, let's go to Leslie. Hello.
Hi, Leslie.
Hello, thank you, Professor. Thanks, World Boston and the Lowell Institute, and thanks, Professor Berkman, for this really interesting conversation. I was just curious, so you talked about a lot about sort of institutional frameworks that, that bring allies and adversaries together. I'm just curious if you think that, to date, maybe the ones that we have worked, and you talked about Russia and NATO being that's a pretty big success right there. But as more actors start playing in this region, commercial and NGOs and military, might we need to sort of invent some new frameworks so that there's dialogue sort of across these many areas? Like, I know that the Arctic Council, for example, their mandate explicitly says they can't talk about military, and there are probably security frameworks where they're not allowed to talk about commercial and economic. So I'm just curious if you think we may need to sort of update and maybe even invent some new frameworks to talk about the relevant issues.
So this is actually the reason I showed that the pyramid of informed decision making, because the solutions aren't magic bullets, they're not specific forums, they're processes. And the processes themselves have to be scalable beyond specific problems per se. So for example, this week or last week, there was a discussion between Secretary of State Blinken and his counterpart in China. They met in Anchorage. And they were talking about China and the United States. They weren't talking about the Arctic, but they met in Anchorage. And the question there is, how do we deal with countries that think differently than the United States, for example? How do we deal with these allies, and how do we deal with these adversaries? And particularly when we know that countries like China and Russia are superpowers. And so part of the challenge is recognizing that we are entering a period which appears to be one of two-track diplomacy, not track one and track two, but two tracks simultaneously. One track involves conflict, clearly things that are difficult to adjust to. And the other track involves common interests. In the case of common interests, Russia, United States, China all have common interest in the pandemic and solving the pandemic. Russia and China, United States also have common interest in climate. And so the challenge is to think in terms of how do we balance national interests and common interests? How do we build common interests? And the easy starting point, the most common starting point is one of conflict. And the observation from the Arctic and the Antarctic and the outer space during the Cold War is that the journey to promote cooperation and prevent conflict starts with a starting point. So if you start with conflict, the journey is filled with conflict. And if you start with cooperation, start with common interests, the journey is filled with cooperation. And so the challenge is to recognize that both of these negotiating strategies exist simultaneously. And it's a choice. And part of the negotiator is to where they start. Do they start with conflict, or do they start with common interests? What is the end objective? Is it a short-term political objective? Is it a long-term sustainability objective? And we're at a moment today, truly, in terms of the pandemic, when issues are on a global scale. How do we as a civilization evolve? How do we avoid the problems that we faced last century with global conflict? Noting today that we have hypersonic missiles that travel a mile per second. So these are real challenges. They are challenges for our generation to figure out in ways that offer hope and inspiration to future generations.
Thank you. Let's go. We've got a couple more questions already queued up. We'll go to Pat.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
We need to get you on camera. Pat, we need to get you on camera, please.
I don't know if I have anything else there. I can talk this way with that.
Yes, you may. Go ahead.
I was wondering about the law of the sea and the status of the United States with the law of the sea now, and how this type of negotiation falls into your discussion.
The law of the sea is perhaps the most comprehensive legal framework on Earth that humankind has developed. The United States has yet to ratify and join the law of the Sea, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. However, most of the features of the Law of the Sea are accepted by the United States and applied under customary international law. The exceptions that the United States has are with the sea floor and the concept of the common heritage of mankind, that the sea floor would be exploited and used and under authority of an authority called the authority of seabed. So the challenge, in a sense, and the question you ask is a complicated one. It comes into the United States Senate with each administration since Reagan's administration, since the 1982 convention, where the president has recommended ratification of the Law of the Sea Convention, but so far that hasn't happened. That means that certain things that are involved with the Law of the Sea, the United States isn't able to participate in. For example, the Law of the Sea allows for continental shelf extensions. The United States is unable to sit on the committee that deals with the Law of the Sea extension proposals. But overall, the United States is operating within the international rules of the ocean, accepts the boundaries that are in place with the concepts of exclusive economic zone, the high seas, as the deep sea area. It accepts notions of territorial sea. And I think the issue of the Law of the Sea is important to put in context of time. So Hugo de Groot, known as Grotius, several centuries ago, had identified the concept of freedom of the seas. So the notion of the Law of the Sea is a long-standing discussion evolving over centuries. And this is really symbolic of where we are as a civilization. It's not just a matter of a political response to the world today. To operate on a planetary scale requires thinking across decades and centuries. And this is the challenge we as a civilization have so yes, did that answer your question, please?
Okay. Pat, thank you for your question. Let's go ahead to Raul. We've got a line of questions here, metaphysically.
Thank you very much. I believe Bahamas would be delighted to hear that continental shelf extension is not an area in which the U.S. can participate. But that said, since most areas of by the way, would you please tell us what your background is? My question, though, is a more serious one. Since the matters of the Arctic, as with the Antarctic, affect the entire globe, the Arctic Council seems to be a pretty much small persons in club for discussions that affect all humanity. And so is there a forum in the United Nations that is better suited, or some other forum, rather than just the Arctic Council, for matters that are really of importance to the whole globe?
Great, thanks, Raul.
So great question. The quick answer is an oceanographer by background. I spent 25 years leading expeditions to Antarctica in the background, scuba diving under the ice. I spent a winter in Antarctica. Diverse background in terms of studying animals on the seafloor, all through geologic timescales and so on, as well as dealing with law and policy on a regular basis. In terms of the Arctic Council is a high-level forum, so it doesn't have the legal capacity of to produce binding agreements. They produce declarations. They operate by consensus. And as a high-level forum, there are advantages. It wasn't created by approval of the United States Senate, for example. It operates in a way that it facilitates dialogues. And initially, the Arctic Council started with the 8 Arctic states and the 6 indigenous peoples organizations, which in itself was a remarkable first step because it brought the indigenous peoples into alignment with nations in terms of discussing and considering issues, impacts, and resources in the region. One of the challenges is under international law is that nations have remits through international court, for example, whereas indigenous peoples organizations don't. And so you could imagine that the Arctic could easily be populated in some type of formalized treaty or convention by nations that are in the Southern Hemisphere, that have no touch to the Arctic at all, or no scientific presence, for example. And so the Arctic Council is a very artful body that has been responsive to changing circumstances. When I showed that picture of the sea ice at the beginning in 2012, there was a period leading up to that of several years when the sea ice was continuously retreating more and more each year. There was at the moment a flag planted at the bottom of the ocean by Artur Chilungarov from Russia, raising issues of claims. And so the Arctic was at a moment when they needed to reconsider how to accommodate the larger interests of the world. And they were responsive by moving the dialogue of the Arctic Council ministerial meeting from mid-level diplomats. And in 2009, it moved to the level of foreign ministers. So in 2009, for example, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was in position. And at that moment, the first declaration to include the word peace was included. And so if we think about complicated terms in international language, law, peace is probably the most complicated word. The word peace wasn't used in the context of the Arctic Council itself because peace is equated with demilitarization. And so the Arctic Council has been responsive. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it has been responsive, and it is now part of a growing arena of similar type of dialogues. So in 2016, under the Obama administration, there was introduced an Arctic Science Ministerial. The Arctic Science Ministerial will meet in May in Tokyo. There is an Arctic Science Agreement, as well as these other binding agreements. So there's an institutional interplay, and the Arctic Council sits in a very important position because of its working groups that focus on issues associated with sustainable development, that conduct the research to create the evidence that leads to informed decisions.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's go on. We have a few more questions we'll try and squeeze in. That said, I'm going to take the moderator's privilege and ask you a really simple question, and you can answer it in a simple fashion, if you would. And I don't want to obstruct our guests, but just looking at the map, the many interesting maps that you showed us, you could see that there's some competing interests here. We're very concerned in the US and many other countries about sea level rise, climate change, and Russia in particular is furiously expanding its shipping. And also we haven't even talked about fossil fuel exception. So just in a simple way, are some countries in favor of sea level rise and polar melting?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's hard to speak for countries, rather than just thinking in terms of common sense. If sea level rises, tens of millions of people will be displaced around the world. Some nations will be underwater. And so whether large nations like it or not, the consequence of sea level rise is a planetary scale perspective. And to answer your question briefly, this is the challenge. How do we operate as a globally interconnected civilization, recognizing that the solutions that are on the table require us all to pull our oars in the same direction?
Okay. Let's go to World Boston's own colleague, Josh Bruno.
Hi, Dr. Berkman. Thank you so much.
Hi, Josh. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining us this evening. I have somewhat of an obvious question, I guess. I'm wondering, what's the relationship between the agreements that you mentioned, the ones that had to do with fishing rights, and the Paris Climate Accord? Are they related at all, or were they even discussed at Paris? And similarly, overall, what is your overall opinion on Paris, does it go far enough? The 2-degree increase or the 1.5 degree increase compared to pre-industrial levels, is that something that you would like to see changed?
So you asked me a number of questions. I'll try and answer some of them. If I don't answer them all, please forgive me. The issues of Paris and the Arctic and climate in the Arctic are intimately intertwined. One way to think about the question you asked is the relationship between John Kerry as the special envoy on climate and Secretary of State Blinken regarding just world affairs. What does the Arctic mean in terms of that dialogue? Could the Arctic be used to facilitate common interest building where other avenues are complicated because of interests in the Arctic, complementary interests in the Arctic? In terms of what do I think of the Paris Climate Accord, it's an important step. It's in a step that emerged in effect from the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change, which created a process of consultative meetings continuously since 1992. And the step with Paris was an important step, but we have to put it in context. A couple of years before Paris, there was a meeting in Copenhagen. The meeting in Copenhagen was discussed, and it was said that if the meeting led to a binding agreement, that the meeting would be a great success. In the absence of a binding agreement, it was considered a failure. However, there were more than 100 heads of state that went to Copenhagen to talk about climate as a common interest at that time. Eventually, they came to an agreement in Paris in 2015, which incidentally was the same year they developed the Sustainable Development Goals and issues dealing with disaster risk reduction. So 2015 was a rich year in terms of progress on a planetary scale. But if we look at 2015 and that agreement, I would note as an oceanographer and an earth scientist that the word water doesn't occur in the Paris Accord at all. The primary driver of the climate system is water. And the context of carbon dioxide actually fits within the absorption spectrum of water. And so it would tell me at the very least, in the absence of including water in the Paris Accord, that the Paris Accord is incomplete. Now, what does it look like? What would be complete? And we're living in a world of change. We can see change over different timescales. We can see exponential change in our pandemic over months to years. We can see exponential change over high technology over years to decades. And we can see exponential change in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and human population growth over decades to centuries. And so in a sense, the challenge that we face is one of coming up with processes that operate in the face of change. And in a sense, the 1992 convention set in motion such a process of iteration, of response and back and forth. And if you draw a line between then and the present, there is progress. And so I think it's to the credit of the negotiators in the world that they saw a moment, they were able to achieve progress in 2015, but it's part of a process. It's not a magic bullet. It's not the end of the game. I hope that answered some of your questions.
Thank you so much. So we'll go to Jeff Simrat.
Hello, Jeff.
I think you're on mute, Jeff.
Okay, now I'm not.
Excellent.
All right. I'm going to ask this question because I'd like you to help me put the discussion that you've offered into context. So please give us your assessment regarding militarization in the Arctic. Who is accumulating arms? What types? And assess the threat level for us to the type of global cooperation that we so badly need.
So excellent question, and militarization in the Arctic are longstanding, continuous discussions. There was many decades when we had a distant early warning system, a DUG line, across the Arctic. I remember being invited to speak to the NATO Maritime Command in London, in Whitehall, 50 admirals on either the two sets of 50 admirals on two long tables, and the NATO Supreme Allied Commander sitting at the other end of us, and on the dais raised above looking into this sea of blue with two admirals for an hour and a half talking about these questions, militarization questions, questions of armed forces. And, you know, I'm not a military expert, but I can do basic scaling arguments. You know, I can understand relative magnitude of things. And the relative magnitude of risk is not on top of the ocean, it's not in the air, it's under the water. And the issue is the submarines with nuclear missiles that have been in the Arctic Ocean for decades. And if you look at the Arctic Ocean in a sense, the militarization that occurs around the side could be argued as just building up what had fallen apart and gotten old, for example, in the case of Russia reinvesting in terms of its military bases. Questions about dog and cat and planes coming in and testing boundary responses and so on in Norway or other areas, those are military strategists, and I don't know exactly how to answer that part of the question. But I do know that in terms of risk, that the real risk has been one that's been controlled and responsive, and it's been underwater. It's the submarines with nuclear missiles that have been positioned in the Arctic for decades. And those risks, in a sense, never went away. And so, you know, maybe it's tongue in cheek to think of a Cold War, but the Cold War is illustrated, demonstrated by the presence of these submarines in the Arctic that had this capacity to, you know, enable massive destruction in Europe, Asia, and North America instantaneously just from the Arctic as a launch position. And so I think it's, you know, to a significant extent, a problem that emerges in the media to hype and to sell the notion of conflict in the Arctic. If you talk to the negotiators, if you talk to the nations themselves, the foreign ministries, even the departments of defense, are cooperative. They're talking to each other, they're working together, they're not looking at conflict. And in my experience, and you know, to whatever extent that is, as a consequence of convening the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia, I also was invited to 5 meetings with Vladimir Putin. So I've listened to him 5 times speak about the Arctic, before and after Crimea. And one thing that was consistent before and after was that for Russia in particular, its economic future is the Arctic. They look at the Arctic as its economic future. So it would be counterproductive for Russia to do anything that would undermine its economic future. And that turns out to be, in my mind, one of the largest stabilizing features of the Arctic, is that there's an interest in economic development, not in conflict.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll go to Mohammed, and then we'll try to fit in James Nadell, a great friend of World Boston. So we'll do sort of a lightning round. Oh,
Okay.
whoops. No, we're going to Owen. I'm sorry. I beg your pardon. Going to Owen. Sorry.
Hi,
Oh,
thank
you
you
with
very
us?
much.
There you are.
Hello.
Okay.
Yes,
So we'll do
hi.
brief questions and answers, see how many we can fit in.
Yes, okay. So my question has to do. Hi, my question has to do with the Arctic as a microcosm for global cooperation. Does success within communications between all these different nations in the Arctic necessarily mean a success in other areas of international climate interests like deforestation or things like rising sea levels?
So the slide that I showed about balancing national interests and common interests, if we look at the world on a planetary scale, about 30%, let's say, of the Earth, it falls within the boundaries of nations, national interests. Under international law, the remaining 70% is characterized in terms of common interests. So the real challenge we face on a planetary scale is one of balancing national interests and common interests. To do this means that we have to be clever. We have to look for precedents and examples, lessons to learn from. And one of those regions is in the Arctic, in particular the Arctic Ocean, where we have national interests surrounding an area of common interests. And how the Arctic states and how the world and indigenous peoples, how everybody works together to facilitate that balance is a question. And presumably the answer to that, the lessons learned, will have relevance on a planetary scale. My hope is that in the coming years of the Biden administration is that Secretary of State and Secretary of State Blinken and Climate Envoy Kerry work together closely to utilize the Arctic as a means of answering that question with global relevance. I mean, the Arctic is feedback in terms of albedo and other things. So it's a good question, and the Arctic has many relevant answers to thinking on a planetary scale.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We'll go to Mohammed.
Here I am.
Good morning, Mohammed.
Hi.
Hello. How are you?
Thank you for letting me ask the question. It's a great presentation. I really loved it. Looking at the map, United States control a little piece of the real estate that's around the Arctic. And the second thing I read someplace that we only have 2 icebreakers and one doesn't work. And what I'm asking is that what's in it for us to be involved so big in this area? And especially if we want to, should we be investing more in this area? So those are the 2 related questions.
So good questions. And it is true, the United States is deficient on its icebreaker capabilities, both for the Arctic and the Antarctic. Whereas Russia has dozens, literally dozens of icebreakers, nuclear powered icebreakers that go through meters of ice. So what does the United States do? Well, part of the challenge is this type of discussion, the one that we're having right now, recognizing that we are an Arctic nation, even though Alaska, and perhaps with consideration in the New England and area, even Maine, touching the Arctic, but Alaska clearly north of the Arctic Circle. We're an Arctic nation. So how do we respond as an Arctic nation? And the answer to your question is not a matter of size, and it's not a matter of economic capacity, and it's not a matter of military might. It's a matter of thoughtful leadership. How do we as a nation facilitate dialogues among allies and adversaries to look short-term to long-term, to answer global questions in ways that not only enhance the security and well-being of the United States, but of all of our nation partners and friends and even allies and adversaries. That's where the real capacity comes from. It's not the economic or the physical presence, it's the leadership. And so this is a question. And how do we as a nation provide leadership with our science, with our diplomacy, that has relevance on a planetary scale?
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's go to James Nadell. What a pleasure. Longtime friend of World Boston. Go ahead, James.
Hello, James.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you. And Dr. Berkman, thanks for spending your time with us this evening. I'll try and keep my question very succinct. Can you make any predictions of Russia's upcoming chairmanship of the Arctic Council in the next couple of years? Do you expect it to keep its chairmanship very narrowly within the traditional scope of the council, or do you think it might attempt to push the limits of the traditional topics and what is taken for discussion and in pursuit of its interests? Thanks.
So my experience with Russia, it's many different people have many different experiences, but mine has been one of cooperation, ongoing cooperation. For example, I teach a course right now actively with MGIMO University in Moscow on science diplomacy. So in terms of the Russian Arctic Chairmanship, which is upcoming in May following Iceland, I think that the interest of Russia has continuously been expressed that they'd like to provide leadership. Well, the question is, how do you provide leadership? And it isn't just with might, in the response to the last question. And so the themes that appear to be emerging for the Russian Arctic Chairmanship can be argued as bases for cooperation, basis for alignment. The challenge is for Russia, I think, to recognize that the Arctic is not just those Arctic states that surround the Arctic Ocean, that the Arctic is a region that includes the indigenous peoples and includes the world more broadly. And so the question really is, how does Russia accommodate the broader suite of interests? And this environment, the circumstances of the Russian Arctic Chairmanship also are complemented by other dialogues. I understand that there's, for example, an Arctic science ministerial process that is including many non-Arctic states. Question is, what are the alignment of the Arctic Council with those other non-Arctic state activities, for example? So your question is a good one. We will know more in May when the formal chairmanship agenda is announced at the Arctic Council ministerial meeting. My assumption is that elements that have been continuing since 2009 will be brought forth into the Arctic Council chairmanship with Russia after Iceland. In particular, that the Arctic is a region of peace and cooperation, and that as a primary objective, science is fine, fisheries are fine, but at the heart of it all is that the region itself is peaceful and stable. And so my hope is that Russia will provide leadership to maintain and accelerate, if anything, the capacity of nations to operate in the Arctic as a peaceful region.
Okay. Thank you for ending on a potentially hopeful note. Thank you so much, Dr. Paul Berkman, for being with us tonight at Great Decisions. Thank you all, and have a great night.
Thank you, Mary.